Okay, good morning. My name is Danielle Johnson, and I'll be briefly talking with you about race and curriculum. And I want to start off with a quote by Nikki Giovanni. And what she states is that it is not who you attend school with, but who controls the school you attend. And I thought that was a great opening for us as we explore how race and curriculum kind of entwine. Another great quote I love is by Carter G. Woodson, and this is he states that the education of the Negroes, then the most important thing in the uplift of the Negroes, is almost entirely in the hands of those who have enslaved them and now segregate them. And again, it's very, interesting how you look at these different concepts of who's educating the black and brown child. Okay, so Carter G. Woodson goes on to state how being taught from books of the same bias, trained by Caucasians of the same prejudices, or by Negroes of enslaved minds, one generation of Negro teachers after another have served for no higher purpose than to do what they are told to do. Okay, so you have biased material and curriculum and it's being perpetuated. So children, black and brown children, again and again are being indoctrinated with these biases about who they are and their culture. So when we look at race, race is crafted by the dominant group in society during slavery as a tool to enforce a dominant group or culture in that society. Race and politics is what I call Siamese twins because they go hand in hand. You have policies that are implemented by racial undertones or just direct race, just racist. So you have those practices and policies that are enforced and is based on perpetuating, again, the dominant culture's group, okay? Then you have, again, like I mentioned, policies that were created to support the racial divide and secure the dominant culture's place throughout all facets of society. So early laws prohibited blacks who were enslaved from reading. So that's when we see our first laws against education and how it impacts those of a different race. After abolishing slavery, the dominant culture crafted educational laws. The birth of separate but equal or segregated schools were formed. We had separate but unequal, which grew into current and present day school systems and structures. Okay, so racial theory continues to be seen through the closing the achievement gap, but we know that black and brown children are required to meet baselines and norms that are established by and for European males, white males. We also know that curriculum in American public schools and private schools only provide between 1 and 2 lessons, or 8 to 9% of total class time is used to teach black history. So that's a huge void if you're constantly being, not seen in the curriculum, not seen in the materials. You start to wonder, where do I fit in a society and in a culture if I'm not white? The narrative of blacks is one of oppression, and that's told through the dominant culture. It reminds me of an African proverb that states, "The hunter will always be victorious until the lion learns to tell his story." Okay? So now we have black curriculum in education, which illustrates the progression in thought of educating while black in America. Functionalism. This is referred to as pity education. And this was crafted and implemented through benevolent whites to teach blacks the basics of how to read and oration skills. Okay, and then we have accommodationism. This is when you see the birthing of the HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities, that focus on vocational and agricultural training. This form of education was designed to train blacks to occupy serving positions in society. So this form of education appeased the white politicians and businessmen, so they found no harm in, continuing to perpetuate that subservient role for blacks. Then we have liberal orientation, and you see again, additional HBCUs were established, and these were supported and influenced by missionary philanthropists. The curriculum was designed to produce yet another level of serving blacks. This time they were to occupy roles of teachers, preachers, and civil servants. But again, we see these are pre-designed and determined roles established and constructed for blacks, but not by blacks. Okay? Then you have the birthing of the black nationalism movement. So this is the evolution of thought that believed in order for the black community to progress, it would require the separate establishment and management of schools, businesses, and all things necessary for the black man to govern and guide themselves. This is when you see the birthing of the Black Wall Street. Many different states, such as Oklahoma, even here in Durham, North Carolina, they had thriving communities and businesses that were owned, operated by blacks. But always something would happen where infrastructure would come in and divide those Black Wall Street towns and separate businesses and communities. Or even still, you see in Oklahoma, the Ku Klux Klan just burnt the entire community down. So anytime the Black men decided to kind of upbuild their communities for themselves, by themselves, they were met with opposition. And that is how we have now ushered into what's called the Black Pan-Africanism movement. And this is the thought that believed that in order for the Black man in the community to be safe, they pretty much had to repatriate back to Africa, so where they could then support and rebuild Africa. So one of the interesting concepts from the reading that I found was that as long as segregation was perpetuated or kind of expressed through white stream America, it was okay. But whenever blacks kind of took on that tone of separate but equal, it was seen negatively. You know, it was like seen as a militant approach or just really negative rhetoric. So I kind of, again, who's telling the story? So if the white person is telling it and it's wrong, it's okay. But if a black person says pretty much the same thing of, separate communities, separate schools, it's seen as, oh no, that's, unpatriotic, it's not supporting of the society. Afrocentrism. This speaks to 6 areas where the Eurocentric curriculum fails. Okay, so it speaks to a history of Africa and Black Africans prior to the slave trade and colonization. It talks about how African history is omitted from the conversation, and it also criticizes the use of deficient language to define and describe Black youth. So we say things like at risk, underprivileged, those kind of things are deemed negative to describe Black youth. But a lot of what the Afrocentrism talks about, I kind of see myself going into this with my research, because it talks about how Africa and the African people were somebody before the enslavement and slave trade. It speaks about the legacy and how civilization can be found in Africa, and it talks again to help to understand the rich culture and history that comes forth from Africa and the descendants of those Africans. Okay, so the current Black scholars are leaning into this dialogue, and we're finding things around the decolonization of curriculum. And when we look at this approach of research, it talks about creating equitable learning environments while challenging structures of white supremacy. It also looks to raise the voice of the marginalized and provide learners with analytical skills and understanding who they are and their place in curriculum and culture. Multiculturalism. This is the bridge of embedding the various cultures within society into the educational systems and establishments from pre-K to higher learning. It is the counter-narrative to the colonized curriculum and diffuses white supremacy in education. But what I did find interesting in the reading was how Cameron McCarthy, he sees this multiculturalism as an offshoot from the language and concepts of the Black radicals and used as a compromise with the structures of education and academia. So he doesn't really see any validity to it. However, I believe when implemented authentically, it can gain and again embeds in all facets of the school system and community. It can address and combat inequity and inequality in the curriculum. So, what do we find that in this race chapter was that here are the areas I agree with. Race was established by the white dominant culture to enforce a divide and subservient system in society. Race was used as a tool to empower and maintain power within the dominant culture. Race and education was and continues to be supported by politics and policies that perpetuate white supremacy. Areas of concern is that race, again, continues to be interwoven throughout the educational structures. We see it in disciplinary actions, classroom design, curriculum, staffing, and testing, and the list can go on. The notion that when Black join together collectively, it is seen as radical, militant, and threatening. And ultimately, my area of concern is that the belief that multiculturalism is an ineffective byproduct is totally false. But what I do hope to see one day is this picture illustration of where you see equality, equity, and liberation. So hopefully we will one day get there. I thank you and have a great holiday.